Top of the AM. Peace. Hotep. You already know what I'm doing, so don't even ask. You know what I'm doing. And I'll be with you just in one moment. What's good with you, though? Okay. Okay. Today we're going to begin with chapter 2. Hold a 3/5 dehumanization. Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. For he had married an Ethiopian woman. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them. Numbers 12, verses 1 through 9. When I bring up the issue of slavery, all too often, I am met with these words. Come on now. Slavery was an accepted institution throughout the world for thousands of years. Every culture has had slaves. Americans were no different. I cannot begin to tell you how many times white people have presented this argument to me. Perhaps this is just another effort to trivialize or justify America's crime. Perhaps it's just another way people try to resolve their internal conflicts. Whatever the motivation, the lengths people will go not to confront their history never ceases to amaze me. The truth is, American chattel slavery was very different from most varieties of enslavement that preceded it. It differed in the manner in which a person became enslaved. It differed in the treatment of the enslaved. It differed in the length of servitude. Most of all, it differed in the way owners viewed those they enslaved. Before the European slave trade began in 1440, most people who became slaves became so as the result of war. Two societies went to war, and the winners enslaved the losers. Sometimes, as the case with Rome, a dominant society would need more laborers, so they made war on a weaker state and took that manpower they required. Europeans, by contrast, systematically turned the capturing, shipping, and selling of other human beings into a business that would develop into the backbone of an entire economy, providing the foundation of the world's wealthiest nation. It's human trafficking, period. The first enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas from Africa in the early 1500s. Again, they said the first enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade was made illegal in the United States in 1808, and it continued in other parts of the Americas until 1870. Estimates of the number of people captured and transported during those 430 years vary. Reasonable estimates place the figure between 20 and 30 million. For the namesake, we're going to just say 30 million. Slavery is a brutal institution in any society. Yet it seems that the treatment of the enslaved by Europeans was particularly so. In ancient Greece and Rome, and throughout the African continent, though slaves were considered to be the property of their slave masters, they often had legal status. Many were able to ultimately gain freedom and citizenship. Slaves were granted freedom under a number of circumstances, depending on the role in which they served. Masters frequently liberated slaves who were considered faithful and loyal. Many slaves over time purchased their freedom. It was not uncommon for owners to free females for the purposes of marriage, in which case children from these marriages were usually free. During the time of American chattel slavery, it was exceedingly rare for a slave to be freed, and rarer still for an enslaved person to buy his or her freedom. Though the slave owners fathered many children by females they had enslaved, they never married the women. and the overwhelming majority of the children they father remained enslaved throughout their lifetimes, even if they wanted to marry. It was illegal to do so. While many societies educated their slaves, southern colonies later became states, usually outlawed such practices. In most societies, it was extremely rare for an enslaved population to reproduce itself through breeding, as did America's enslaved. Typically, children born as slaves in places other than the Americas were born free. In many societies, slavery was more akin to an indentured servitude. There was a fixed amount of time enslaved persons were held in service to their owners, after which time they would be granted their freedom. In America, generations were born into slavery and died there. That black Africans sold other black Africans into slavery is well known and is often offered as a rationalization by apologists for the institution of slavery. This has led to significant misunderstandings regarding the role of Africans in the slave trade. When enemy tribes in Africa made war, the conqueror took prisoners and made them what we call indentured servants, not chattel. With the coming of the European slavers, vanquished warriors could be sold in an effort to reduce the enemy tribe warriors' forces. Even so, Africans could not imagine the level of degradation and hardship experienced by slaves in the Americas, since they did not behave that way toward those they conquered. Consequently, when Africans sold their captives to white slave merchants, there was no way for them to know how they would be treated upon their arrival in America. Thus, we have no way to determine how Africans would have responded had they been aware of the conditions to which they were condemning those they sold. Of greater import is that the American slavery experience was based exclusively on the notion of racial inferiority. According to Thomas D. Morris in Southern Slavery and the Law, 1619 to 1860, Africans were considered to be presumed or natural slaves based on their skin color. They were also referred to as thinking property and inherently rightless persons. In few societies, if any, was so large a group of people considered to be less than human based upon physical appearance. Yet Europeans concluded that black Africans were fitted by a natural act of God to the position of permanent bondage. It was this relegation to lesser humanity that allowed the institution of chattel slavery to be intrinsically linked with violence. It was through violence, aggression, and dehumanization that the institution of slavery was enacted, legislated, and perpetrated by Europeans. The Three-Fifths Compromise. We've subscribed to the doctrine, might one of our Southern brethren observe, that representation relates more immediately to persons and taxation more immediately to property, and we join in the application of this distinction to the case of our slaves. But we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property and in no respect whatsoever as persons. The true state of the case is that they partake of both these qualities, being considered by our laws in some respects as persons and in other respects as property, and being compelled to labor not for himself but for a master, and being bendable by one master to another master, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the capricious will of another, the slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. And being protected on the other hand, and being protected on the other hand, in his life and in his limbs against the violence of all others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, and in being punishable himself for all violence, and in being punishable himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of the society, that is a part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, not as a mere article of property. The federal constitution therefore decides with great propriety on these cases of our slaves when it views them in mixed character of persons and of property. This is in fact their true character. It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live, and it will not be denied that these are the proper criterion, because it is not only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Negroes into subjects of property that a place has disputed them in the computation of numbers, and that it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with other inhabitants. Sound confusing? It should. Let me put this passage in perspective. James Madison, the primary author of our Constitution and the slaveholder, wrote this passage during the Constitutional Convention of 1787. One of the most heated debates at the convention was what to do about the slaves. A number of delegates from northern states saw this as an opportunity to abolish slavery. Most of the southern delegates, most of whom were slave owners, intended to continue the practice. After much heated argument and debate, all but one state agreed to eliminate slavery. That one state, South Carolina. threatened to go its own way and not become part of the United States if slavery was to be curtailed. The delegates, unwilling to lose South Carolina, acceded to its demands and so were stalemated. To resolve this logjam, delegates decided to table the discussion of abolition to a later date. Slavery would continue to be legal under the Constitution. This posed another problem. How were slaves to be figured into each state's population count? Delegates considered this. The more people residing in a state, the representatives of that particular state can send to the House of Representatives, and hence the more power that state can wield. Northern delegates arguing that slaveholders view Northern delegates arguing that since slaveholders view those enslaved as property and grant them no rights, proposed that slaves not be counted at all toward the state's total population. Southern delegates attempted to argue that slaves should be counted as part of the population. The previous excerpt is an example of an attempt at resolving the problem. The main thrust of Madison's argument is that slaves should be considered property for tax purposes and individuals for the purpose of determining the state population. He goes on to explain how it is that slaves are both persons and property. You can see the absurdity of this argument and the ludicrousness of the situation. Here you have slave owners having just defended their view that slaves are property and part as justification for committing some of the most heinous crimes against other human beings, now trying to claim them as persons. And why? So they can have a greater power in the soon-to-be formed federal government. Why did they need this power? To continue the institution of slavery as the economic juggernaut it had become, and to prevent the Northerners from passing legislation for its dismantling. The agreed upon solution to this problem was the 3/5 compromise. Rather than each enslaved individual being counted as a person, 3/5 of a state's slave population will be counted toward that state's total population. In this way, the enslaved became 3/5 of a human. I really want to go in. Fuck it. I'm going to read this too, because this is something I actually should just end this now, because a lot of people still suffer from cognitive dissonance. Easing the conscience. That's the title of this next section. By the time of Madison, it was generally accepted among many people in America that blacks were inferior. A significant portion of the population viewed Africans as a lesser species of human than those of European descent. Native Americans fell into the same subclass of human. Why did these views come to be so widely held? Why did the humanity of Africans as well as Native Americans come into question? When we commit a negative act or think about doing so, most of us get uncomfortable. This discomfort is caused by the difference between our action and what we believe about ourselves. For example, most of us would experience a certain amount of discomfort if we were to seriously consider robbing someone, and even greater discomfort if we were actually to do it. Why? Because most of us think of ourselves as decent people, and decent people do not rob others. This discomfort is called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive, having to do with thinking. Dissonance, meaning discord. The greater difference between our actions and self-perception, the greater cognitive dissonance, and so our discomfort. Humans do not particularly like this discomfort, so whenever it occurs, we almost immediately try to resolve it. And we can resolve it in one of two ways. One way is to own up to the negative act and address the harm caused by it. The other way is to justify the negative act rather than admit any wrongdoing. They deserved it. It is a typical justification. In instances of particularly egregious negative acts, such as wars of aggression, enslavement, and genocide, the perpetrators have to go so far as to dehumanize and in many cases demonize their victims. During the past 500 years, Europeans have spent significant resources to prove that Africans and those of African descent are inferior. The difference between the actions of the Europeans, enslaving, raping, and killing, and their beliefs about themselves, that they're good Christians, was so great and the cognitive dissonance so painful that they were obliged to go to great lengths in order to survive their own horrific behavior. Chattel slavery and genocide of the Native American population were so unchristian that the only way they could make their actions acceptable and so resolve the dissonance was to relegate their victims to a subhuman level. Madison's statement serves to demonstrate how far intelligent men will go in their efforts to rationalize their untenable positions. Europe's efforts to justify slavery and the slave trade began in the 16th century, and America followed suit soon after. In the New History of Social Welfare, Phyllis Day observes, Virginia led in the way of enslavement of people of African heritage when in 1660 it made them servants for life, forbade intermarriage with whites, and gave children born of African descended women the status of their mothers. although there were some religious qualms about making Christian slaves. In 1667, it was decreed that conversion to Christianity would have no bearing on slave status. Slavery as a practice in North America was a response to the Protestant religio-economic dictum that wealth demonstrates morality and to the even older dictum of fear and hatred of outsiders. Because Africans did not worship the Christian God, their lives were insignificant compared to the mandate of wealth for their masters. Slavery was not, for the most part, seen as evil at all, but almost a morality, since it protected slaves from destitution, put them to work, and led to wealth for God's chosen. These beliefs created a system of slavery unequaled in brutality and gave rise to the American brand of racism. Being a Virginian, Madison came from a 140-year tradition of resolving cognitive dissonance by dehumanizing those of African descent. By the time equivalent of three-fifths of a human, it didn't end there. Efforts to prove blacks inferior continue to this day, 2020. These efforts have been so successful that many white people believe their superiority to be true, and many others, while they don't believe it, act as if they do. Even more telling, many African Americans act as if they believe it as well. Damn fools. I'm gonna stop right there. When we get back into this, we're gonna talk about the power of definition. If you are concerned about what's going on with this gentrification and the solution to what we can do, I strongly urge you and anyone that considers themselves to be a member or concerned about the Black community sincerely to link up with us at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning at the Crucial Center right there on. I want to say that it's between like Fugeron and Urban. I'm not sure, but I know it's right there on Moselle, just past Genesee Street, like a block, not even a block, like a half a block past the Juneteenth headquarters. Also, if you don't have the subscription to Kemetflix, www.kmtflix.com, go ahead and get that. You know what I mean? We definitely appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here today, but I hope your today is great and your tomorrow was greater. Share. It doesn't cost anything. Support the people. One.